All right, welcome to this set review for Magic the Gathering, The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. What a title. So today I'm going to be going over the cards that I think are viable, new staples, or at least worth discussing or remarkable in some way or another. So first let's talk about the format legality. This set skips Standard and goes directly to Modern, so that means this set is going to be legal for Modern, for Legacy, for Commander, for Pauper, but it skips over Standard and therefore skips over Pioneer. So many of the cards might have seen some sort of play in Pioneer, especially I looked at a lot of them and it seems like many of them would have been good inclusions in Nykthos Ramp, but obviously they're not legal in Pioneer, so we will be skipping any consideration of that format for this set review. So let's move on to the first thing. So the first cards we're going to be looking at are the legendary monocolor lands. So these are monocolor lands. They produce one mana of whatever single color they are, white, blue, black, red, green. And they all have the same restriction where they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control a legendary creature, but they all have different activated abilities. The costs are different and the restrictions to activate the abilities are different. So we're going to go through all 5 of these cards and see how good any of them are. So let's start with Minas Tirith. So Minas Tirith adds white and it has 1 white. Tap, draw a card, activate only if you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn. So right off the bat, this seems like it's a fairly easy enough requirement to get. You just need to have 2 creatures. Now, the legendary enters tapped requirement is the issue here. You want this to be able to enter untapped, especially if you're playing a cheap creature aggro deck that's going to want to make use of this ability. So how many good legendary cheap creatures are there? Well, there's a few. So there's cards like Ragavan, Thalia, Skreld. But after that, the number of legends kind of drops off. And there are some other ones, but mainly these are like the good ones that you would actually want to play. So it's a question of how reliably can you actually get this to enter play untapped? If you can play enough legendary cheap creatures to make this enter untapped, then I think this ability is quite strong, since if you're in an aggro deck, attacking the 2 creatures and then being able to draw a card for such a cheap rate is pretty good. So I think that Minas Tirith is overall the best of the cycle. So let's move on to Rivendell. Rivendell, same restriction, and it has 1 blue, tap Scry 2, activate only if you control a legendary creature. So the Scry 2 makes it very comparable to Castle Vantress. The problem here is going to be twofold. It's going to be 1, again, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a legend, and then having to control a legend even to activate it is another big problem. So a blue land like this that has a Scry ability is obviously best in something like a blue-white control deck where Castle Vantress typically shows up. You know, there are other blue decks that could play Castle Vantress, but they generally don't want to. So the big upside to Rivendell is how much cheaper the cost to activate it is than Castle Vantress. However, entering tapped and not being able to activate it are big downsides. In fact, if you think about a blue-white control deck, you're probably not going to have any legendary creatures in the deck, period. So this is going to enter tapped all the time, unless you have maybe Kahira as a companion in the sideboard. That's the only situation I can see where this enters untapped and when you can actually activate it. So there are ways of being able to activate it in that kind of deck, but they're pretty sparse. So again, a lot of these are going to come down to how easy is it to actually get the activation requirement or the enter the battlefield untapped requirement going. I think this one's going to be a lot harder than Minas Tirith, and the effect is also worse. It is still good, as we've seen Castle Vantress be played before, but the problem is if you want this kind of effect, why wouldn't you just play Castle Vantress instead? So let's move on to Barad-dur, the black one, and this one has XX black, tap, amass orcs X, activate only if a creature died this turn. So if you're unfamiliar with what amass does, this is a returning mechanic from War of the Spark, and it basically means if you don't control your amass token, so this is the token here, if you don't control a token, you put the token into play, in this case with X power and toughness, whatever you paid for it. But if you already have an army in play, then instead of putting a new token into play, you put +1 counters on your existing army. So this seems kind of comparable to Castle Ardenvale. If you look at the cost to activate and what you get out of it, it's 3 mana to get a 1/1, 5 mana to get a 2/2, 7 mana to get a 3/3, and so on. The problem is this activation requirement. A creature has to have died this turn. So that means that on top of the cost to activate this ability, you then also need the cost to cast whatever removal spell you have to kill a creature so that you can do this. Or you have to be playing a deck like Aristocrats where you just have sack options like Witch's Oven or something, so where you can get this activation going. And then there's the fact that it's just not that powerful of an effect to begin with. The cost is, for a 1/1, it's 1 mana cheaper than Castle Ardenvale, and then you can potentially make bigger tokens if you have more mana. but you also don't get to split the tokens up, where like Ardenvale can make a 1/1 period, whereas here, if you already have a token, then you're putting more counters on the same token. I think if you were just looking at the cost of it, it would be worth paying 3 or more potentially to get these tokens. It's going to be the restrictions. Having to control legendary, and especially having to have a creature die in order to activate this, is a huge downside. So I think that alone is going to prevent this from really seeing play. The only place that I could see it showing up is in, again, something like Jun's Sack. So next up we have the Mines of Moria. This is our red legendary land, and we have 3 red, tap, exile 3 cards from your graveyard, create 2 treasure tokens. So in this case, the restriction is actually not that hard to get. Having 3 cards in your graveyard to exile isn't too bad, although paying 4 to activate it is a pretty big downside. The bigger problem is just, what do you want this in? And if you have a land that all it can do is make 2 treasure tokens, then the deck that obviously comes to mind is creativity decks. But the big problem with being able to play it is that creativity decks also play Dwarven Mind. Dwarven Mind is essential to creativity's game plan, and Dwarven Mind requires that all of your lands be mountains. You want every single land you play to be a mountain so that when it enters, you get the 1/1 dwarf token out of it. If you play Mines of Moria, then that's a land that isn't a mountain, meaning that your Dwarven Mind may not come in untapped and make a dwarf token, since this is one of the lands. So I think that right there basically kills any shot for this land to see play. I think creativity was the only deck that could have possibly wanted it, and without that, it's probably not going to see any play. And last, that brings us to the Shire. This is our green land, and this has 1 green and tap an untapped creature you control, create a food token. So basically, it's a Gilded Goose on a land. This is okay. There are food decks in Modern. They're not that good. They're around like tier 3 decks at the moment. There are a lot of food matters and food generating cards in this set, so they probably juice those decks a bit, but I still don't see them really being top competitive decks in the format. This ability is okay. The cost is pretty low. The restriction, you just have to have a creature to tap. That's easy enough. It's a matter of, is making a food token good enough? I think if you're playing a food deck anyway, then this is probably a land that's worth including. The issue is just going to be, again, are food decks even good enough to where this will show up at all? If they are, then yeah, you'll play this in your food decks. So going back to all 5 lands, I think I would put this as Minas Tirith in first, the Shire in second, and then after that, I don't think the other 3 will see play, but if they do, I would put Rivendell in third, and then Barad-dur in Mines. It's probably like Barad-dur 4th, Mines 5th. So let's move on to Boromir, and this is going to be our first example of the Ring Temps You. So first, let's just go over what Boromir does. So Boromir is a 3-mana white legendary creature. It's a 3/3 with vigilance and a human, if that matters. It has, whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. And sacrifice Boromir. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn, and the Ring Tempts You. So before we get to what the Ring Tempting You does, it has 2 abilities taken from Lavinia and Selfless Spirit. And both these creatures have proven to be good abilities in themselves, so combining them both onto here is pretty good. Now, the fact that this is 3 mana, it does make it a little worse than these, but it has better stats. And the fact that it combines both of these 2 abilities, where oftentimes these 2 creatures, like sometimes you have Selfless Spirit and then an opportunity to sacrifice it never really comes up, and then it's just a dinky 2/1. Or you have Lavinia, and then it's just a dinky 2/2, and it doesn't really do much. This does have better stats and has both of the abilities tacked onto it. It's also easier to cast than Lavinia since it doesn't require blue mana, and especially in Legacy, where you have cards like Ancient Tomb and Moxes, you can get this down potentially easier than these other cards. You can play this in a deck like White Stompy. It's also probably better than either of these 2 cards in CEDH stacks decks, where having both of these abilities comes in quite handy. So I think Boromir is a solid card. Now, the Ring Tempts You, let's get to that. I don't think the Ring Tempts You matters at all, but let's just go over what it does. So the Ring Tempts You is essentially an emblem. So as the Ring Tempts You, there's lots of cards in the set that either as part of their spell effect or as a trigger, they say the Ring Tempts You. So what does that do? Well, as the Ring Tempts You, you get an emblem named the Ring if you don't have one, and then your emblem gains its next ability, so these abilities, and you choose a creature you control to become or remain your ring bearer. The ring can tempt you even if you don't control a creature. The ring gains its abilities in order from top to bottom, and once it gains an ability, it has the ability for the rest of the game. So it gains this ability, then this one, then this one, then this one, but it maintains all of the abilities that it's gained regardless of whether the ring bearer dies. Each time the ring tempts you, you must choose a creature if you control one, and each player can have only one emblem named the ring and only one ring bearer at a time. Okay, so what are the actual abilities? Well, The first one is your Ring Bearer is legendary and can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. That is pretty weak. Your creature being legendary really doesn't matter too much. It matters occasionally for cards like the channel lands like Besage to make them a little cheaper, or maybe if you have a deck that's playing Mox Amber or something, but really doesn't matter too much. And can't be blocked by creatures with greater power is essentially Skulk, and Skulk isn't that good either. So then we move on to the second ability. Whenever your Ring Bearer attacks, draw a card and then discard a card. Now this one is a lot better. Being able to loot when you attack is a much better ability, but it is an issue that this is the second one that you gain. Then we move on to the third ability. Whenever your Ring Bearer becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller sacrifices it at end of combat. So essentially super Death Touch. It's Death Touch for things that wouldn't die otherwise. So like if you attack a Cauldra and the Cauldra blocks, they still have to sack the Germ token. And then finally, whenever your Ring Bearer deals combat damage to a player, each opponent loses 3 life. So initially, this feels somewhat reminiscent of Dungeons and the Initiative, but I think 2 of the things that made the Initiative mechanic so good were, 1, the abilities of the Initiative mechanic, which the Initiative could draw you a card or cheat creatures into play off the top 10. These abilities are much worse than that, with probably looting being the best one of them. And secondly, the Initiative would just gain the abilities naturally. You didn't even need to control a creature or do anything. You would just, the moment you had something that made you gain the Initiative, you would just keep progressing on the dungeon. This mechanic feels a lot more like the older dungeons that were all pretty bad and didn't see any play. And although we haven't gone through all the cards in the set yet, it is a big problem that most of the cards in the set that have the Ring Temps You on them are just not that good to begin with. So ultimately, I don't think this is that relevant. And if you take cards that have the Ring Temps You on them, I think for the most part, this is essentially trinket text. It matters a little bit, but for the most part, you have to evaluate these cards based on if they're good enough without this, with this just being a little bonus. So let's move on to Forge Anew. Forge Anew is a 3-mana white enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, return target equipment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. As long as it's your turn, you may activate equip abilities anytime you could cast an instant, and you may pay 0 rather than pay the equip cost of the first equip ability you activate during each of your turns. So right away, the obvious home for this card is Hammer Time, where it's basically acting as a 9th plus copy of Sigarda's Aid / Pure Steel Paladin, where it's allowing you to freely equip an equipment, including at instant speed. Returning equipment from the graveyard is kind of interesting too. If they blew up a hammer, you can get a hammer back. And one of the things that this also does is that it lets you have sort of a cranial plating effect, where one of the issues with Hammer Time was you would hammer your creature. So, you attack with an Ornithopter or whatever, and then you flash hammer in with Sigarda's Aid, or you just move the hammer onto it with Pure Steel Paladin, and then the opponent could respond with removal. They could kill the creature that has the hammer on it, and then you would just lose out on the damage. Whereas with Forge Anew, since you can activate the abilities at instant speed, it means you can move the hammer around to different creatures. Especially if you have Pure Steel Paladin, it means you could just move it all over the place no matter what gets killed in response. So this, I think, is pretty good. I asked a Hammer player Anew, who's a pretty good player, if this is going to see play in the deck, and they said for sure this is going to be 2 to 3 copies in the deck. Now, on top of that obvious inclusion in Hammer Time, the card also has some possible implications with Goblin Engineer. So if you play Goblin Engineer, you get to put an equipment into your graveyard, and then Forge Anew can return it to the battlefield for free. So, for example, you play Goblin Engineer on turn 2 and you bin a big equipment, and then on turn 3 you play Forge Anew and you bring it back from the graveyard. So obvious picks are Cauldra Complete is a pretty good equipment to cheat out on turn 3, which would be the same rate as if you played Stoneforge Mystic, but it also unlocks Argentum Armor as a turn 3 play. So for example, let's say you play Goblin Engineer, you put Argentum Armor in the graveyard, and then if your opponent doesn't respond to kill a Goblin Engineer, you play Forge Anew next turn, you bring Argentum Armor back, then you use the free equip ability to just attach Argentum Armor to Goblin Engineer, and then you have Vindicate on attack plus 7 damage. So this is also a possible inclusion. So let's move on to the next card, the One Ring. So the One Ring is a 4-mana legendary artifact. It has Indestructible. When the One Ring enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on the One Ring, and then tap, put a burden counter on the One Ring, then draw a card for each burden counter on the One Ring. So kind of a weird template, since the most relevant and best abilities are kind of going from bottom to top, where this is the best one, then this one matters on this, then this is the next part that matters, and then this part is the last part that matters. So essentially what this is it's a multiple draw spell where the One Ring can draw 1, then 2, then 3 cards. Then you're going to start losing life based on how many counters are on it. And then these abilities here are, I guess, nice bonuses, but they're not really why you're playing the One Ring. So first of all, it's an artifact, therefore it's Carnival. So this can just be added to the many cards that Karn can grab from the sideboard. So I think it's going to be an immediate staple in any deck that's playing Karn the Great Creator as just another sideboard tutor piece that can just be a card advantage engine. Since I think you can probably win the game based on how many additional cards you're drawing off of it before this losing life part matters. Secondly, it's going to be really good, in particular in a deck like Dice Factory that's playing lots of untapped keys. So Manifold Key and Voltaic Key, where you can just untap this and draw more cards multiple times in the same turn. So imagine you play the One Ring, you tap it, draw a card immediately, then you pay some mana, you untap it with Manifold Key, you tap it, you draw another 2 cards immediately. And if you've ever played or seen Dice Factory played, you know that they have lots of mana and lots of untap effects, so you could potentially draw a ton of cards off of this. The protection from everything also means that against certain combos or attacks, you can't die the next turn. So if you're playing against an aggro deck, you play this, none of their creatures can damage you. If you're playing against a deck like Storm, for example, and their kill condition is Grape Shot or Tendrils of Agony, they can't target you the turn after you play the One Ring, so they can't kill you on that turn either. And in a deck like Legacy Painter, for example, where you have cards like Goblin Welder, there is the potential of being able to weld the ring in and out of your graveyard over and over and over to gain protection over and over, and that may be able to beat certain decks as well. So I think the One Ring is also a very good card and will definitely see play, probably in Modern and Legacy. Commander, I'm not so sure, because for your card draw effects, you need to be able to draw a ton of cards, but this is, over time at least, and with especially with untap effects, drawing a lot of cards as well, and the life loss matters a lot less in Commander when you have 40 life, so we'll see if it shows up there too. So next we have Reprieve. So this is the white remand, but just to go through it, it is 1 and a white instant, return target spell to its owner's hand, draw a card. So this is basically remand. I mean, technically it's a little bit different in that remand had to counter the spell. So if the spell was uncounterable, you wouldn't counter it. This just bounces the spell, period, regardless of whether it's an uncounterable spell or not. The big upside here is going to be that it's in white instead of blue. So remand has fallen out of favor pretty hard in Modern. It doesn't really see play anymore. The only decks that it shows up in are Storm, and sometimes it'll be in a deck like Creativity, where essentially the issue with remand is that you can't just let your opponent get the spell back, or it's kind of similarly acting as a bounce spell. It's best in combo decks where it doesn't matter that you're letting them get their spell back, because you're just trying to out-tempo them by basically you just bounce their spell back, slow them down, and then combo out, which is why a deck like Storm or Creativity can play it. Now, Reprieve is in the same boat, but specifically because it's in white. So there are decks that may have wanted to play a remand, but they didn't have blue mana. So Reprieve can go into those decks. I'm not sure exactly what decks would want this, but for example, what's something that comes to mind is like Heliod Company. Heliod Company is a white combo deck that doesn't have any blue mana. Maybe it wants to play Reprieve, who knows? We've seen decks occasionally play cards like Mana Tithe, where Mana Tithe is not that great of a spell either, but it's just the fact that it's in a color that doesn't traditionally get that effect. So I think Reprieve is pretty good, and specifically because it's a white spell. If it wasn't a white spell, it'd be a lot less interesting. It would just be remands numbers 5 through 8. But because it is a white spell, it gets to see play in places that it normally wouldn't, and those decks may want it. So let us move on to Gandalf the White, and I've put a lot of these here for numerous reasons, but first let's just go on to what exactly does this card do. So Gandalf the White is a 5 mana white legendary creature. It's a 4/5 with flash, and it says you may cast legendary spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. And if a legendary permanent or an artifact entering or leaving the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So it's sort of like a Panharmonicon, similar to Elesh Norn Mother of Machines, where it is doubling the ETB and leave triggers of your specifically legendary permanents and artifacts. So the issue here is that if you actually look into it, having the restriction of the thing that you're getting the trigger off of having to be a legendary permanent or an artifact is actually pretty restrictive, and there aren't that many cards that are good that fit the bill. So there are various cards like Oath of Nissa is legendary, so you would get 2 triggers. Fibblethip is a legendary creature, so you would draw 2 cards. And because of the Leaves ability, again, there's not that many Leaves abilities, but we do have stuff like Chromatic Star that draws a card when it leaves, so you will draw 2 cards off of Chromatic Star if you have Gandalf in play. And the thing really pushing this over is the part about Flash, that you can both flash Gandalf in, and you could flash in the cards that you're getting double triggers for. So to me, it feels like it sort of plays like a combination of Elesh Norn and Wandering Emperor. Obviously, the cards are very different, but the combination of Flash and the doubling up of the permanent abilities does seem pretty interesting to me. Now, right off the top of my head, I don't see any deck that this specifically goes into. So if you think about the decks that traditionally are interested in playing lots of ETB triggers, so those decks have been decks like Elementals or Bant Coco. But if you think about those decks, they don't play any artifacts. And as far as their legendary permanents go, they have things like Omnath would draw 2 cards, but then there just really aren't any other legendary creatures in the decks. And I think in those decks, Elesh Norn is the more powerful card in terms of what it's doing when it's in play, especially shutting down ETB triggers of your opponent. It's also worth noting that if you play Karuga as your companion, as some decks have, we've seen some Elementals decks and some other decks try to play Karuga as a companion, Gandalf will double trigger Karuga, and you can flash Karuga in as well with Gandalf in place. That's pretty interesting. I think ultimately, if Gandalf does see play, it's probably more likely to be its own build around, similar to how there were legendary creatures in Horizons like Urza and Yawgmoth. I'm not saying that Gandalf is as good as those, but I think it's more of a build around, like build a whole deck around Gandalf rather than it going into an existing deck. So let's move on to Delighted Halfling. So Delighted Halfling joins the ranks of many of our other best mana dorks. It is a single green mana, 1/2 creature. It can tap to add colorless, or it can tap to add 1 mana of any color, but you can only spend that mana on a legendary spell. However, the spell can't be countered. So it's kind of a Cavern of Souls mana dork for legendary spells. The big question here, so there's a lot of Legendary Matters cards in this set. And the question is going to be, similar to like all the legendary lands we talked about earlier, like Minas Tirith and whatnot. The big question is going to be, are there a sufficient number of cheap legendary creatures or just playable legendary creatures to where these cards are good? And the answer to that is, I'm not sure if there are right now. If there are, you'd probably have to build whole shells around this. Like, I don't think there's any deck in Modern, for example, that Delighted Halfling just slots into. You would probably have to build a whole new deck that takes advantage of legendary creatures and Legendary Matters cards in order to make these good. However, even if cards like these aren't good at the moment, Wizards will continue to print new sets, and especially with their heavy focus on Commander, as we're seeing in a set like this, for example, they're going to keep printing a lot more legends. So even if they're not good now, they will be at some point. It's also worth noting that Delighted Halfling is really, really good in CEDH. Being able to make your commander uncounterable is a fantastic ability. There were decks in CEDH that would play Cavern of Souls before, but this is a mana dork that just doesn't even care to, you don't have to name a specific tribe, it just taps for anything of that legendary spell and any other legendary spell in your deck. Whereas a card like Cavern of Souls in those decks was often a land that would only tap for your commander. So I think this is going to be a immediate staple in CEDH. Next, we have Flowering of the White Tree, continuing the Legendary Matters trend. We have a double white 2 mana legendary enchantment that says legendary creatures you control get +2/+1 and have Ward 1, and non-legendary creatures you control get +1/+1. So again, I think if you were just looking at it for this ability right here, this wouldn't be good enough. We already have other 2 mana anthems that just don't see any play. So it's going to be, is this ability good enough? And it's going to be exactly the same issue as the legendary lands like Minas Tirith, like Delighted Halfling. Are there a sufficient number of cheap, good, playable legendary creatures that you could play in an aggressive deck that this would enable? It's also kind of awkward that one of the best legendary creatures that's cheap that comes to mind is Thalia, which makes this more expensive. But there is the possibility that you could play some other thing. Again, it pumps Ragavan, it pumps Skrelv, there's other legendary creatures that you could play if you're willing to go up in more mana. Like Humans in particular has a lot of legendary creatures like Adeline that would also get pumped by this. So again, I think it's another example of, even if this isn't good yet, it probably will be at some point. And continuing the Legendary Matters trends, we have Great Hall of the Citadel. It is a land that taps for a colorless, or you can pay a colorless and tap it to add 2 mana and any combination of colors, which you can only spend to cast legendary spells. So if you remember Interplanar Beacon, this is a card that's very similar to Interplanar Beacon, except instead of only being able to tap the colors for planeswalkers, it's any legendary spells, which includes planeswalkers as well. And I'm going to keep repeating myself again. I think this is a matter of how many good legendary spells are there in this case, multicolored deck that you'd want to play. In this case, it doesn't have to be creatures. It could be a Super Friends Planeswalker type deck that maybe you want access to this land for, but I think this is another land that's worth considering. So next, let's move on to Nasty End. Nasty End is a 1 and a black instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. If the sacrificed creature was legendary, draw 3 cards instead. So we're continuing the legendary trend here. So first, let's examine the card, assuming this text wasn't here. So if it was just sack a creature, draw 2 cards, well, we've seen that effect a lot, in particular on Deadly Dispute. And if this is the only part of the text on the card that is effective, like if this is the only text that matters, then Deadly Dispute is just better. Deadly Dispute also gives you a treasure on top of drawing the 2 cards, and it can also sack an artifact, not just a creature. So that part of Deadly Dispute is just better than Nasty End. And there's other cards that are similar to Deadly Dispute, like Reckoner's Bargain, that are basically the same thing. So again, the question is going to be, how many cheap creatures that are legendary do you have that you can sack to Nasty End? So if you look at decks that play cards like Deadly Dispute, those are basically Rakdos and Jund Sack. And those decks have Ragavan and Kroxa. And those are basically the only 2 legendaries that those decks play. And if you're doing it with Kroxa, that means you have to have 4 mana, so you can play Kroxa and hold priority before it dies and cast Nasty End. And in this case, I think it's going to be the same thing. I think at the moment, there's probably not enough good, cheap legendary creatures for this to be worthwhile, and that Deadly Dispute and cards like it are just going to be better than it. But eventually, if we get enough good, cheap legendary creatures, this card will eventually be better. Drawing 3 cards is a really big upside over making a treasure and being able to sack an artifact. Although, you probably wouldn't cut Deadly Dispute, you'd probably just play both of them. So let's move on to Orcish Bowmasters. This is probably the card in the set that's got the most hype, other than maybe like the One Ring. This is a 2 mana black creature. It is a 1/1 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target, then amass Orcs 1. So let's just not look at the extra card drawing clause on that. At its base rate, this is 2 mana, 1/1 flash, make a 1/1. So it's 2 mana for 2 power and toughness split amongst 2 different creatures at flash speed. So the question is, what does this extra card drawing clause do? Well, it basically means if your opponent is playing extra card draw spells like Brainstorm, like Glimpse of Nature and Legacy Elves, you can flash Bowmasters in response, and then you get to deal X damage equal to however many extra cards they're drawing, and then make either a large army or, put more counters on the army that you already have. Also, you can combine Orcish Bowmaster with cards like the Collective Defiance, where you can wheel your opponent's hand. They discard, draw a bunch of new cards, and then Orcish Bowmasters triggers a whole bunch of times. And this is particularly great in CEDH, where you can play cards like Wheel of Fortune, like Windfall, where if you do those things, then your opponents are collectively drawing 7 cards apiece, so they're drawing, 21 cards. Orcish Bowmasters triggers 21 times and makes a 21 power army and deals 21 damage split out however you want. And this is particularly good in a format like EDH, where there's lots of cards like Rhystic Study, like Mystic Remora, that get played, where they're just going to be incremental draw effects that Orcish Bowmasters gets to keep picking off. You have cards like Esper Sentinel, which is a commander staple, which Orcish Bowmasters, the moment the Esper Sentinel triggers, just shoots Esper Sentinel immediately and it dies. So the card has a lot of uses. I think it is overhyped, because if you think about a card, so let's think about a card like Hull Breacher. So outside of Commander, if you look at Legacy, how often does a Hull Breacher get flashed in and, wreck a Brainstorm or, wreck a Glimpse of Nature? Things are not actually as easy to line up as they may look. It is better that, Orcish Bowmasters is only 2 mana instead of 3, so it is easier to cast, although it's not blue, which is a downside, but whatever, that's fine. The whole, ambushing your opponent when they've got some multiple card draw spell thing on the stack, these things just always seem easier to line up than they are. Now, that's not to say the card is bad. The card is very good. It's just not going to be the big blowout that you're expecting. It's similar to another card like, let's say, Opposition Agent, where Opposition Agent can come in and affect someone's fetch lands and maybe, do some good off of that. But more often than not, this is going to be something that comes in and it ambushes one thing maybe, or oftentimes you're just going to flash it in and then it's just going to prevent extra card draw spells going forward. So your opponent isn't going to cast a Brainstorm or a Ponder or whatnot while Orcish Bowmasters is already in play. Again, very good card. Just, let's temper down the whole ambush potential on it. I think this card is probably best in CEDH, then it's second best in Legacy, where there's lots of blue cantrips that get played. And then in Modern, there are less card draw spells, although there are still plenty. It's probably okay to flash in against Omnath or something. So let's leave it at that for now. So moving on, we have the Land Cyclers. So this is a cycle of mostly expensive creatures, except for the blue one, which is a spell, that have 1 mana to land cycle them. And then they all have various stats and abilities. They're all like 6 mana around there. The red one has Trample. The black one can't be blocked unless by multiple creatures. Those parts don't really matter. What's going to matter here is, are these cycling cards playable in Living End? It's debatable. So one of the issues is, let's look at Troll of Khazad-dûm. This is probably the one that Living End would be the most interested in playing. It's hard to block, it has high power, and it's black, which means you can pitch it to grief. The problem is that Living End doesn't play any swamps. It does not play any actual black lands usually, much less lands that are also card type swamp. Or you could play Generous Ent or Oliphant, since the deck is in Temur colors and it does play mountains and forests. The question is just going to be, are any of these cycling creatures better than any of the cycling creatures that are already in the deck? If they are, the two options are probably either Waker of Waves or the 4/4 Sphinx. So it's potentially possible that any of these could see play. There's also the question of, how much do you want to find your third land to cascade into versus just having your spells cycle for another card? I think the deck is interested in hitting its third land. It sometimes will just brick on the third land, which is how a Living End can sometimes lose the game. So if this sees play, I'm guessing the most likely one is Oliphant, since it has the best stats out of all of the creatures, has Trample, so it's, gets in damage better, and can cycle for mountains, which are already in the deck. Next, let's move on to Samwise Gamgee. So this is going to be another Food Matters cards. It is a 2-mana green and white legendary 2/2 creature. And it says, whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you create a food token, and you can sacrifice 3 foods to return target historic card from your graveyard to your hand. Historic cards are artifacts, legendary spells, and sagas. So I think while this ability is nice, it's fine, the main one is going to be this one, the making food whenever creatures enter the battlefield. That is going to be the thing that makes Samwise primarily played, and it's again going to see play in food decks if anywhere. Now, it's kind of awkward that food decks are not green-white, so food decks are traditionally Jund or Esper in their combinations, but it wouldn't be too hard to just splash white and Jund or splash green and Esper for Samwise. The value that you get out of this, again, there's lots of cards that care about food, like Cauldron Familiar, Asmo, Trail of Crumbs. So there's plenty of those cards, and this is just a really good way of making more food tokens. It also, incidentally, can go infinite if you have Cauldron Familiar and a sack outlet that you can activate over and over. So it has to be a different sack outlet than Witch's Oven. So if you have Samwise, Cauldron Familiar, and a sack outlet, you go Samwise and a food token. You then sack Cauldron Familiar to the sack outlet. You then sack the food token that Samwise generates to put Cauldron Familiar back into play. Cauldron Familiar entering the battlefield triggers Samwise, which puts a food token into play. You then sack Cauldron Familiar to the sack outlet, you bring Cauldron Familiar back by sacking the food, and repeat to infinitely drain your opponent. This is a 3-card combo. It does require that you have all 3 of these cards, but if you're a food deck that already wanted to play Samwise and Cauldron Familiar anyway, then it's not too big of an ask to add a few sack outlets like Viscerous here into the deck to enable this combo. I think the main thing holding the card back is just going to be, again, the power level of food decks. Food decks are tier 3 at the moment, so they would need to be a lot better. It's basically like, yeah, if food is good, Samwise is going to be good, but if food isn't good, then it won't. There's also the potential that since this sacks 3 foods to get a card back, there's maybe some kind of infinite loop you can do with that, but you would need some way to generate 3 foods at a time off of whatever it is that you're getting back. I don't see a combo that can do that. This feels more to me just like, if you have a bunch of extra food lying around, you can get your Asmo back, you can get, whatever thing you need back. So let's move on to Rosie Cotton of South Lane. So Rosie Cotton is a 3-mana white legendary 1/1 creature, and it has when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token, and whenever you create any token, you put a +1 counter on target creature you control other than Rosie. So this card initially doesn't look that interesting, but the thing that makes it good is that it infinitely combos with Scurry Oak. So Scurry Oak is a 3-mana green 1/2 creature with Evolve, which means when a creature enters that's bigger than it, either on power or toughness, it gets a +1 counter, but importantly, whenever one or more +1 counters are put on Scurry Oak, you may create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. So if you have Rosie Cotton and Scurry Oak, you go Scurry Oak and play, cast Rosie Cotton. Rosie Cotton enters and makes a food token. This triggers Rosie Cotton. You put a +1 counter on Scurry Oak. This triggers Scurry Oak. You put a squirrel into play. That triggers Rosie Cotton. You put a +1 counter on Scurry Oak. You make a squirrel. You make a +1 counter on Scurry Oak. You make a squirrel, and on and on and on infinitely. So you get an infinitely large Scurry Oak, and you get infinite 1/1 squirrels. And because Scurry Oak's ability is a May trigger, you can just stop at a certain point. It's not an unbreakable loop. It's also highly notable that both creatures can be cocoed into. So previously, there was a combo with Scurry Oak and Ivy Lane Denizen, but the problem was that Ivy Lane Denizen cost 4 mana, which 1 made it more expensive, and 2, you couldn't cocoa into Ivy Lane. But now you can cocoa into both creatures. This seems really good. I'm not sure if this is going to be its own deck, or if this combo slots into already existing green-white cocoa decks like Heliod Company, like Devoted Druid. These cards don't really have any overlap with those other combos, but you could play just a second combo in a deck that's already playing cocoa anyway. Now, one thing to note, though, is that technically this infinite combo doesn't win the game immediately. So you make infinite 1/1s, but then you still have to pass the turn before it comes back to you and you get to actually attack with them. And this can sometimes be an issue. So, for example, if you recall, Urza decks that are playing Thopter Foundry and Sword of the Meek also have an infinite combo where you assemble all 3 of those cards, you make infinite Thopters and gain infinite life, but it is still possible to lose. Your opponent can wrath the board and destroy everything that you have. They can be a combo deck in themselves, like a Storm deck or something, and be able to kill you even with that. So in those Urza Thopter Foundry combo decks, it was always important to have a way for Urza to win you the game on the spot. You would always want to include at least one card in your deck that would be a outlet for Urza's spinning infinite mana ability so that you could just win the game immediately. I'm not saying that the combo isn't good because of that, but it is any infinite combo that requires you to pass the turn before you can win is obviously worse than one that just wins on the spot. Although there is the potential of being able to cast Coco on your opponent's end step and put both of these into play, combo off, and then just immediately untap and kill them. But that is something that you should keep in mind. So next we have Arwen Mortal Queen. Arwen is a 3-mana green and white legendary 2/2. It enters with an indestructible counter, and then you can pay 1 and remove the indestructible counter from it to put a +1 counter and a lifelink counter on another target creature and on itself. And that creature gains indestructible until end of turn. This card would not be that interesting on its own. If you just look at it in isolation, it's a 2/2, and sure, it has indestructible, but so many removal spells exile now with Prismatic Ending, Solitude, Leyline Binding. So why is this card any good? Well, the card is good specifically in exactly one deck, and that's Heliod Company. Heliod Company combos with Heliod and Walking Ballista to deal infinite damage to your opponent. And that requires that Walking Ballista has 2 +1 counters on it and has lifelink while Heliod is in play. And traditionally, this combo would cost you somewhere between 4 and 6 mana. So if you only had Heliod and Walking Ballista, you would have to pay 4 for Walking Ballista so that it enters with 2 counters, and then you'd have to pay 2 with Heliod to give Walking Ballista lifelink. Or if you had Pendelhaven, Spike Feeder, Conclave Mentor, something that causes Walking Ballista to either enter with an additional counter or not die when you remove the counter from it, then you could play the combo with Ballista only on 2 mana. So you could play Ballista on 2, activate Heliod to put a counter on it, or to give it lifelink rather, and then combo from there. But that still costs you 4 mana. With Arwen, this means that you only need 3 mana. If you have Heliod in play and Arwen in play, you can cast Ballista on 2, and then you can activate Arwen and put a +1 counter and lifelink counter on Ballista and win from there. So it reduces the cost of the combo by 1 mana. Is this that good? No, but it is probably an auto-inclusion in the Heliod Company deck as at least a one-of creature. So let us move on to Frodo, Determined Hero, which is a 2-mana white 2/2 legendary creature. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may attach target equipment you control with mana value 2 or 3 to it. And as long as it's your turn, you prevent all damage that would be dealt to Frodo. So right away, this joins the ranks of cards like Kemba, Pure Steel Paladin, Fervent Champion, cheap creatures that let you equip stuff onto it for free. But importantly, it is mana value 2 or 3 equipments, which means you do not get to attach Colossus Hammer to it for free. That means that Frodo does not see play in Hammer Time and can only see play in decks like Sunforger or Stoneblade decks that see cards like Fervent Champion get played in them. So Frodo can immediately equip cards like Sword of Fire and Ice to him. The problem is those decks are not that great to begin with. They're kind of fringe tier 3 or lower decks. And while they are definitely interesting, and it is better that we're getting more creatures that have the same sort of effect of freely equipping things, the biggest issue is just that there's not that great of equipments. Like even Sword of Fire and Ice, as good as it is, just really doesn't see that much play in Modern. It's only very rarely sees play. It's more in Legacy, I guess, because Stoneforge decks with the Inti are more played in Legacy. So this is another card that can do that. And the fact that it prevents all the damage to it on your turn means it is effectively safe from Bolt, Unholy Heat, and cards like that when you're moving to equip it. So it is better in the sense of if you have this and an equipment and your opponent has red burn-based removal, they can't just kill it before you move the equipment to it. Is it that good? Again, it's dependent. How good is Fervent Champion? It's about as good as Fervent Champion, let's say. So if decks that play Fervent Champion and free equip stuff like that gets to see more play, then Frodo should be a good inclusion in those decks. So let us move on to Pippin, Guard of the Citadel. It is a 2-mana white and blue legendary 2/2. It has Vigilance, Ward 1, and tap another target creature you control gains protection from the card type of your choice until end of turn. So this is basically the same sort of creature as Giver of Runes, Mother of Runes, Skrelv. It's that same sort of ability. Differences are its card type that you get protection from rather than a color, which I think is basically going to be the same thing in almost every scenario. You can choose creature if you want your guy to be unblockable, and against any other spell like instant or sorcery or whatever, probably going to be the same thing. It's not exactly the same thing if your opponent is playing sorcery speed removal. So let's say they go, you have a creature that you're trying to protect and they go like bolt that creature, and you give it, you say pro instant in response, and then they cast Fury. Okay, so if you had a color protection you named red, that would have protected it from both. But most of the time, this is going to be the same thing. The big difference here is going to be 2 mana versus 1 mana, and that is a big downside, especially when you consider the curve of when these kind of cards see play. So if you think about decks that play cards like Giver of Runes, Mother of Runes, those decks are looking to play Giver, Mother on turn 1, and then on turn 2, they're looking to play Stoneforge Mystic, Pure Steel Paladin, Thalia, Devoted Druid, cards on 2. If you have to wait another turn for Pippin, that just slows your curve down by an entire turn. So probably the 1 mana difference is going to be the deal breaker here. Now, just to highlight some of the upsides, it does have slightly better stats as a 2/2, so it can technically attack, I guess. Not that well, but it can, especially since it has Vigilance. It itself has Ward 1, which makes it slightly difficult to kill. Not that difficult, but slightly. And it is blue, which can matter for cards like Force of Will, Force of Negation, Subtlety. I think ultimately the downside of being 2 mana just overshadows everything else, but it is at least worth talking about. So let's move on to Flame of Anor. So Flame of Anor is a 3 mana Izzet instant, and it says choose one. If you control a wizard as you cast the spell, you may choose 2 instead. So it's a charm, and the modes are target player draws 2, destroy an artifact, deal 5 damage to target creature. So let's examine this if this clause was not here. So if it was just a charm that did one of these 3 things, it would probably be okay, but not that great. It's a draw 2 or shatter or deal 5 to a creature. The fact that you get to choose both if you have a wizard makes it very good. So even against decks that don't run any artifacts, it's still at its default draw 2, kill something, which is a 3-for-1. The issue here is going to be how many good wizards are there? How many good cheap wizards are there that you can actually play, especially on turn 2 before you cast Flame of Anor? So some highlights are Snapcaster Mage is a wizard, and many may forget, but Dark Confidant is actually a wizard as well. So you could play this in like a Grixis control deck or something. The problem is, outside of these 2 guys, there's really not many good options. There are some other wizards that are maybe playable, like for example, Emry is a wizard, but Emry and this card are not going to see play in the same deck. So it's a matter of you need a wizard. It needs to be in blue, red, or maybe black, some color combination that makes sense for this sort of effect. It needs to be a wizard that has an effect that makes sense for this sort of effect. And it needs to be a wizard that probably costs 2 mana so you can follow it up with Flame of Anor. Not exactly, like you can still play Snapcaster Mage later in the game, but that's what you need. Could this card be good just with Snapcaster Mage? Maybe. But Snapcaster Mage has fallen off for reasons beyond not having good charms to play with it, so I think that is not the issue here. It is worth highlighting. Again, it is a pretty good effect if you can get it, if you can get the Wizard Claws going, and as we see, again, more creatures are going to get printed. There's going to be better, good wizards at some point, so even if it's not good now, expect it to show up later. So keep it on your radar is what I'm saying. Next, we have Council's Deliberation. This is a 2 mana blue instant, and it says draw card. And whenever you scry, if you control an island, you may exile Council's Deliberation from your graveyard if you do draw a card. So if this card's going to be good, what are the cards that scry that are good? Well, we have Serum Visions and Opt in Modern, and we have Preordain in Legacy. And that's kind of it. Those are basically the good scry cards. And even in Modern, Serum Visions and Opt have really fallen out of favor, where usually Consider is better than Opt, and players are playing Expressive Iteration instead of Serum Visions now. So the question is going to be, could this really be good enough? And also, so if you're playing Council's Deliberation and Legacy, that means you're saying you're playing Preordain either on top of Ponder and Brainstorm, or you're having to cut Ponder for Preordain. So aside from just the scry restriction, you have to look at the other restrictions. So this has to be in your graveyard. You have to control an island. That's easy enough. But it's the fact that these two abilities are split up. So if you think about this, when you cast your draw spell, you typically want to draw, get more gas in your hand, and then be able to deploy those threats or spells. But this has the card draw split up into 2 different instances. So 2 mana, you draw a card, you untap, and then you have to cast another cantrip that can scry for you in order to get the second part. Or you just have to leave this in your graveyard for later when you're going to scry on a later turn because you want to be deploying either a threat or holding up interaction. I think that is also one of the parts that's going to be another issue. And also, if you're looking at Legacy as a place to play this, you could also just play Predict, which is probably going to be better than this card as well. So any card that can draw you 2 cards for 2 mana is worth looking at. I think it's just, the issue is too many hoops to jump through, the main hoop that you have to jump through of scrying is kind of scrying, and it being split up between 2 different instances is sort of the issue here. I don't expect this to see play, but I thought it was worth remarking about. So next we have Display of Power. It is a 3 mana red instant that costs double red. It says this spell can't be copied, and copy any number of target instant and or sorcery spells. You may choose new targets for the copies. So the first thing that comes to mind is Storm. This just screams Storm spell. The problem is, if you actually look into this, what can you do with this? So, okay. Option number 1, you are playing a Storm deck that's playing it out like Grape Shot. So cast Grape Shot, put all the Storm copies on the stack, and then hold priority and cast Display of Power, copying all the Storm copies. The issue is that Storm already basically does this. So even if Storm isn't winning on the initial Grape Shot, Storm plays Remand. And you can just remand the Grape Shot back to your hand and then just cast Grape Shot again. This is 1 more mana than Display of Power, but when you're in your Storm combo turns, lack of 1 extra mana is not the issue. You usually have as much mana as you need, and the issue is just, it's usually card draw. It's getting the critical mass of spells that you need for this to win the game. So I don't think Display of Power does anything there. Then the other thing that this can do is it can do a Mindbake Trap similarity. So if you're playing against Storm, let's say in Legacy where Storm decks are more common, let's say they cast Tendrils of Agony at you. You can respond to Tendrils of Agony with Display of Power, copy all of their tendrils, and kill them. The issue is, why is that any better than just playing Mindbreak Trap? You can just Mindbreak Trap the Storm deck, exile all the copies off the stack, and then you haven't technically won the game, but you've stopped their Storm turn, and they've probably exhausted a lot of resources acquiring that Storm turn. So isn't Mindbreak Trap, which is free, just better than Display of Power? So Display of Power looks like it has a sufficient power level to be good enough. I just can't think of anywhere that you would actually run it. It feels like any place that you would run it just has better options than itself. We'll see if that bears out. Next we have Long List of the Ents. This is a 1 mana green enchantment, and it is a saga. It has 6 chapters, and every chapter is the same. Note a creature type that hasn't been noted for it. When you cast your next creature spell of that type this turn, it enters with an additional +1 counter on it. So immediately what came to mind was Hardened Scales. Is this card good enough for Hardened Scales? I mean, it's a 1 mana green enchantment that puts +1 counters on things. Is that good enough for Hardened Scales? So the first issue is going to be, you can't use overlapping card types. So Hardened Scales, these are the most commonly played cards in Hardened Scales, and you'll see that Construct overlaps on 3 of the different creatures. You've got Hangerback Walker, Ballista, and Patchwork Automaton as constructs, and then Ravager is a beast and Zabaz is an insect, but these 3 have overlapping card types, which means even if you play Long List of the Ents and then you follow it up with another one of these creatures, you can't follow it up with then another construct creature. Another issue with it is that the +1 counter only applies when you cast the creature. So it doesn't work with +1 counters entering for any other reason, like modular shenanigans, for example. So I think even if the card didn't have that creature type restriction, it probably still wouldn't be good enough for Hardened Scales. So let us move on to Moria Marauder. This is a 2 mana double red goblin 1/1. It has double strike, and whenever a goblin or orc, but goblin is what matters, whenever a goblin you control deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library, you may play that card this turn. So the question is going to be, so this is basically a card advantage goblin. Now, Goblins already gets card advantage goblins. It has Snoop and it has Ringleader in Legacy. So the question is going to be, is Moria Marauder either better than either of those 2 card advantage cards, or is it just good enough on its own that you can play it in addition to them? I think it's probably not as good as either of those 2 cards, since you need to be able to get in damage, and then you can only, impulse draw the cards, so you lose them at the end of turn. But it is still interesting. Goblins is typically a deck that plays a bunch of cheap go-wide creatures, so if you are attacking your opponent and consistently hitting them with, 2 or 3 creatures and getting an additional look of 2 to 3 extra cards off the top of your deck and being able to cast maybe 1 or 2 of them, this does look pretty good as an addition to goblins. So let's move on to Elven Farsight. This is a single 1 mana green sorcery, and it says scry 3, then you may reveal the top card. If it's a creature, draw a card. So basically you scry 3, and then you have to make sure the top card of your deck is a creature so you can draw it, because if it's not a creature, then you don't get to draw it. I think the problem with this card, like many other green ponder-ish effects that we've seen before, is that this is just worse than Oath of Nissa. Oath of Nissa is also looking at 3 cards, and it's getting you a creature, but it can also get you a land or planeswalker. This doesn't get you that. Now, there are times when the scry might matter. Maybe you need a card that isn't one of those types, and you want to leave it on top. I don't know how relevant that is. It really ultimately comes down to, I just think Oath of Nissa is better than this, and Oath of Nissa doesn't see that much play either. It sees some occasionally, but the fact that this can find multiple different types and this can't, and also Oath of Nissa is being a permanent matters in other ways. Being able to blink it or, bounce it back to your hand with 3 fairy, or just, otherwise bounce it, get it back, blink it, whatever, is also better. So Elven Farsight, we already had Adventurous Impulse in green as another ponderish effect, and that sees no play whatsoever. I think this card's better than that card, but I think this card is probably also not going to see any play. So next, let's move on to Wizard's Rockets. This is a 1 mana colorless artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay X, tap, and sacrifice it, add X mana and any combination of colors. When Wizard's Rockets is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. So the card that this is most similar to is Terrarion. It comes into play tapped, you pay some amount of mana, tap and sack it to add colors in some kind of combination, and when it dies, draw a card. It is better than Terrarion because you can pay any amount in X, even 0. If you're just looking to cycle it, you can pay X as 0 and just draw a card, or you can pay X as more if you want more than 2 different colors and combinations. And we have seen cards like Terrarion be played in the past with decks like KCI Combo, Eggs, and Second Sunrise, and those cards got banned out of the format. So if we see another card like KCI show up and it's a combo deck that wants to have a bunch of cheap artifacts that cycle themselves, then you could see Wizard's Rocket seeing play. Does one of those decks exist at the moment? No. If it did, they would play Terrarion. But if one of those cards does exist in the future, then Wizard's Rocket is a card to keep in mind. It is better than Terrarion and can be more copies of it. So next, we're going to look at Shire Shirriff. This is a 2-mana white creature. It's a 2/2 with Vigilance, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a token. When you do, exile target creature and opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So we've seen many different variations of this effect. The white creature that enters, exiles something, and then when it leaves, the thing comes back. The most prominent and best version of that card at the moment is probably Brutal Cathar. And this is a 2-mana version of that effect. The big downside is obviously that you have to sack a token. So that it's a matter of, can you play a deck that is white, that wants this sort of effect, it wants a Brutal Cathar, and it has tokens to sack, and it wants the 1 mana difference between the 2 cards. So right off the bat, the only decks that I can think of that really are interested in sacrificing tokens for some kind of value play that's not a combo are the food decks. Asmo Food, Jund Asmo, which are not white decks. So that is a big problem here. The only other card that comes to mind in terms of like white spells that make cheap cheap tokens to sacrifice is things like Thraben Inspector. It makes a clue token. I think right now there probably isn't a deck that this card wants to play. Basically, you have to satisfy the following conditions. You want to play a Brutal Cathar. You want the 1 mana difference to be very important, and your deck has to have enough tokens for this to be able to, most of the time, be able to trigger, and you don't mind sacking the tokens. So I don't think this will see play right now. Maybe eventually there will be a shelf for it, but not at the moment. So let's move on to sideboard cards. So these are cards that are good or maybe good in some capacity, but they're not cards that you would main deck. So these cards are going to be Stern Scolding, Eowyn Fearless Knight, Westfold Rider, Fear Fire Foes, and Cast Into the Fire. So let's go through these one at a time. So first up, we have Stern Scolding. And Stern Scolding is a single mana blue instant, and it says counter target creature spell with power or toughness 2 or less. So right off the bat, there's going to be decks that don't have creatures in them, or decks that have creatures in them that don't meet this requirement, or don't have enough creatures that meet this requirement. So it's essentially a matter of how many decks are there where this is a reasonable sideboard card. And the breaking point here is how many staple creatures or highly played creatures in Modern, Legacy, Commander, and whatnot have power or toughness 2 or less, and how many that are highly played do not. And here they are. So this is most of the top played creatures or reasonably often played creatures in Modern, Legacy, and Commander. And you will see from this list that there are certain decks where you can basically counter everything. So against Yawgmoth, you basically counter everything in that deck with Stern Scolding. Against Hammer Time, you basically counter everything in that deck with Stern Scolding. But the issue with cards like Stern Scolding or other restrictive counter spells like Minor Misstep, Spell Snare, etc. it's not what they can counter, it's what they can't counter. So what does Stern Scolding not counter that gets played often or a reasonable amount of the time? And here they are. Stern Scolding does not counter Amulet Titan. It doesn't counter 3 of the Evoke Elementals, Subtlety, Fury, Endurance. It doesn't counter Murktide or Death Shadow, Norn, Omnath, Kroxa, the Eldrazi creatures. In Legacy, it doesn't counter any of the Initiative Boys, Sheoldred. In Commander, there are commanders that it doesn't counter, like Kenrith, Winota, Crom. So the question is going to be basically, there are decks where Stern Scolding will basically counter all the creatures. So do those decks represent enough of the metagame that you want Stern Scolding against those decks? So if Hammer Time and Yawgmoth are everywhere, yeah, you want Stern Scolding. But if they don't represent enough of the metagame, if they only represent a small fraction of it, and you'd be better served with a counterspell that did something else, then you probably don't want Stern Scolding. So for Stern Scolding, probably not good enough, but there are decks that this hits everything in. So let's move on to Eowyn Fearless Knight. Eowyn Fearless Knight is a 4 mana red and white legendary 3/4 with haste. And it says, when it enters the battlefield, exile target creature and opponent controls with greater power. Legendary creatures you control gain protection from each of that creature's colors until end of turn. This part right here is not, this is like an extra bonus. This is not really relevant. This is the main part. So you'll note this ability right here, this is not a Brutal Cathar effect. This is permanent. The creature that gets exiled goes away forever, even if Eowyn dies. So decks like Death Shadow or Murktide, these are big creatures that Eowyn gets rid of. So how is this a sideboard card? Well, Human Tribal is not really a deck right now in either Modern or Legacy, but they have been decks in those formats before. So if Humans ever makes a comeback, this is a card that you could play as a sideboard card. In fact, you probably would want to. You'd want to play a creature like this against Murktide and, Death Shadow decks, especially when those decks also play Cavern of Souls and you can get this in without it being able to get countered. Next, we have Westfold Rider. This is a 2-mana white creature. It's a 3/1, and it says sacrifice it, destroy target artifact or enchantment, activate only as a sorcery. So this joins the ranks of other cards like Cathar Commando that we've seen in the past, where it's literally the same cost and power and toughness. Also a human, which is relevant. And it's just another creature that's also a naturalized. And there's other creatures like Outland Liberator, Kasali Pride Mage, and the big difference between this card and those cards is that all of those cards require 1 mana to activate them. This doesn't have a mana payment in the activation cost. So if the 1 mana difference, if that's important, then this is a better version of those cards. Now, the problem is activate only as a sorcery, and that is very relevant against decks like Hammer Time, like Amulet Titan, decks that are combo killing you on their own turn, where being able to activate at instant speed is very important. So the main question you have to ask yourself with this card is basically, do you want a naturalize effect on a creature, especially like a human creature in a deck like Humans, and does the 1 mana difference of activating it counteract the fact that it's a sorcery speed activation? I think it probably does not. I think being able to activate at instant speed is probably more important, especially when you have a deck that's going to play a card like Westfold Rider is also probably playing cards like Aether Vial or Monodorks like Noble Hierarch, so that's probably not an issue either. And I think the ability to snipe hammers, Urza Sagas, Amulet of Vigors is going to be more important than sorcery speed. So there's Fear Fire Foes is next. This is a X and a red sorcery. It says damage can't be prevented this turn, and it deals X damage to target creature and 1 damage to each other creature with the same controller. So right away, this is similar to cards like End the Festivities that deal 1 damage to every opposing creature, which we've seen show up in sideboards to fight cards like Elves and other small creature decks primarily in Legacy, although the effects like this have fallen off somewhat recently. So the main difference is going to be, you don't actually have to pay anything for X. X can be 0. So the main issue is going to be, the creature that you target is different than all the other creatures. So all the other creatures are taking 1, but the one creature that you're targeting is taking X. So if you want that creature to also take 1, then you need to pay 1 for X, and that makes this card 2 mana. However, if the creature has more than 1 toughness, this card can kill it, whereas End of Festivities can't. So if I'm thinking about a deck like Elves, this could kill Nettle Sentinel, where End of Festivities wouldn't. But I think most of the time, you probably just want the cheaper card that's going to always just deal 1 to everything versus this more expensive card that can occasionally deal extra damage to a single creature. Then we have Cast into the Fire. This is a 2-mana red instant. You choose 1. It deals 1 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures, or exile target artifact. So this seems very similar to a card like a Braid, where one mode is deal damage to something, and the other mode is get rid of an artifact. The difference is obviously you're dealing 3 damage with a Braid to 1 thing versus this one you're dealing 1 damage to 2 things. So how relevant is it killing a single creature with higher toughness versus killing multiple creatures with lower toughness? Also, the fact that the artifact gets exiled is relevant in certain ways. It can get rid of Cauldra, whereas a Braid cannot. If the deck has any sort of recursive abilities, like let's say Emry, then this exiles them. But also, since it exiles them, that means decks that play Karn can fetch the card back from exile. So I don't think this card is better or worse than a Braid. It just really depends on what the metagame is. Are there more decks that are playing cheap multiple creatures that this can deal 1 damage to? Is exiling an artifact better than destroying it? You just have to weigh, which of these effects are more important in your metagame as a sideboard option. So moving past sideboard cards, we have cards that are basically for Commander mostly, and not really for 1v1 60-card formats. So first, let's look at Last March of the Ents. This is an 8-mana green sorcery. It can't be countered. You draw cards equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control, then put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Right away, I'm not sure if this card is CEDH playable. It's expensive, it requires you have an expensive creature, and it requires that your deck be playing a bunch of expensive creatures to cheat in. However, the fact that this can draw a ton of cards and then skip the cost on putting a bunch of creatures that are potentially very expensive into play for free is very interesting. We've also seen decks that have existed before, like Selvala Heart of the Wilds, which are built around playing creatures with high power or toughness that also generate a ton of mana, and this card would fit right into those kind of decks. Then there is Borne Upon a Wind. This is a 2-mana blue instant. It says you may cast spells this turn as though they had flash and draw a card. So we have seen certain CEDH decks play cards like Emergent Zone that let you flash in all of your spells during a single turn. These are combo decks that are trying to go off at instant speed, so those are decks like the Gitrog monster. So if there are other decks that want Emergent Zone type combo enablers for instant speed and are blue, Borne Upon a Wind seems like it would fit right into that. And then we have Lotho Corrupt Sheriff. Lotho is a 2-mana white and black legendary 2/1, and it says whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, you lose 1 life and create a treasure token. So we've seen this templating of whenever the second spell gets cast, trigger, do a thing on Ledger Shredder before. However, I think there are some important notable differences. First of all, Lotho is white and black instead of blue, which means it's harder to cast, it's more restrictive in the decks that it can go into, and not being blue means you can't pitch it to force, force of will, force of negation, subtlety, etc. Ledger Shredder is also better stat-wise. It has flying, is a 1/3, and if you're triggering it immediately, it's a 2/4 flyer. Lotho does not grow any bigger and is a 2/1 and dies to every removal spell, doesn't block or attack well. And I think also looting is better than getting a treasure. The 1 life also matters somewhat. So I think in 60 card 1v1 formats, Lotho is probably not that good unless putting treasure tokens into play, like getting extra free artifacts matters a lot. There's also the fact that, decks that play lots of cheap spells that you can cast one after another so you can consistently have a second spell to cast are typically decks like red and blue Spellslinger decks that would play a card like Ledger Shredder and not a card like Lotho. I think Lotho is much better in a format like Commander where you have multiple other opponents that are also casting spells, getting you treasure tokens, and the 1 life loss in 40 life Commander is also not nearly as relevant as in 1v1 matches. Also, of course, CDH is a format that's defined by Tymna being one of the best commanders in the format, and any cheap creatures that can attack are immediately just better in Tymna decks. So it's there too. So I think this is a slam dunk in Tymna decks, and probably any commander deck that has black and white, and not going to see play in 1v1. So moving past Commander, Best in Show. What are the best cards in the set? So my picks for the best cards in the set would be these 6. Reprieve, the One Ring, Forge Anew, Orcish Bowmasters, Rosie Cotton, and Minas Tirith. I think these are probably the best picks for 1v1 playability. Out of all of them, I think Forge Anew is probably the best one just in terms of we know this is immediately going to go into Hammer Time. It's no question. This is just going to be a slam dunk staple in Hammer Time. Hammer Time's already a tier 1 deck in Modern, therefore this is an immediate tier 1. If any of the other cards are maybe better than Forge Anew, that's a possibility, but at least this is the best immediate option we have in terms of we know this is going to see play. My next bets would be the One Ring. The One Ring is definitely going to see play in Karn decks, Dice Factory, those kinds of things. Orcish Bowmasters will probably show up as well as another staple card. I'm not sure exactly what decks it goes in. It's probably more playable in terms of format ranking, best in CEDH, then Legacy, then Modern. The other cards are more iffy in terms of what they can go into, like Reprieve. Are there white decks that want to play Remand? Rosie Cotton, is her combo with Scurry Oak going to be good enough? Minas Tirith, is there a deck that's playing cheap legends and is aggro and has multiple attackers that wants it? These are the more questionable cards. So in terms of my ranking, I would probably put Forge Anew as the best Modern card, Orcish Bowmasters is the best Commander card, and then for Legacy, it's probably Orcish Bowmasters as well out of these 6. So yeah, those are my picks for the best cards in the set. So if you enjoyed, I hope you enjoyed the video, and stick around for more content in the future. So thank you for watching, and take care.